Mother's Day has a way of sneaking up on you. But when it does, 1-800-Flowers makes it easy to send mom something beautiful, thoughtful, and worthy of everything she does. Right now, with double blooms from 1-800-Flowers, order 1 dozen roses and get another dozen for free. It's a bigger gesture with fresh, beautiful flowers arranged to make Mother's Day feel as special as she is. Make Mother's Day feel bigger with double blooms at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast.
911, what's the nature of your emergency?
Welcome back to the Tactical Living Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Walton, joined by Sergeant Walton. Clint, how are you?
I'm good.
Whenever I see portrayals of a couple going to marital counseling, I always see things break down to a lack of communication. And something that I've never really heard a lot of people talk about when it comes to being in a relationship with a first responder is the way that trauma can actually change the communication in your marriage.
I think it's something, especially from the first responder side, is we hold information back because we don't want to bring it forward, or it's uncomfortable for us to even talk about, or you want to protect your spouse, your loved ones of, they don't need to hear about what I had to experience. And if you start holding information back and not communicating with, whether it's that traumatic incident or it's something that's affecting you on a regular basis, all you're doing is pushing yourself out of that problem.
So today we're going to unpack how trauma exposure, chronic stress, and nervous system adaptation actually changes the way that couples speak, sometimes the way that couples listen, and how they respond to each other. I think it's important that what looks like miscommunication on the surface can often be a deeper issue of emotional safety, regulation, and even protection.
I think when we're always trying to hold information back from one another and not being able to effectively communicate, it does more damage than good. And I don't think it's talked about enough, or we don't sit down and recognize that this is the biggest issue.
So the psychological concept I want to talk about is called trauma-informed communication, and it recognizes that nervous system states directly impact how we express and receive information. And as it pertains to a couple, when one or both partners are dysregulated, then conversations can very quickly shift to become defensive, to be able to shut down with each other, even leading to escalation. And it's important for us to understand that, because a lot of times it doesn't even matter what the topic is. Sometimes this happens, and then what I have noticed is it also becomes a repeat pattern in your relationship.
And when you get stuck in repeat, that's where it becomes a routine, and it becomes kind of, this is the normal practice and how, we're responding to one another. And you don't want to go down that routine route, because then it's harder to break.
And a lot of times what I've seen in working with clients, or when people reach out to me, is small disagreements turning into bigger reactions than they should have, or one partner just shutting down totally, and then the other partner goes on this hunt and then basically just continues to pursue the conversation. Sometimes you'll have difficulty feeling heard or understood, or even misinterpreting somebody's tone, maybe misinterpreting their silence or even their intent, and then repeating that same argument without any kind of resolution.
And that's one of when we don't get resolution to whatever those problems are going on, I think that's where we start harboring that resentment more, or we're holding on to that, not being able to unpackage what's really going on. And that's why it's so important to be able to effectively communicate with your spouse, with your loved ones, because when you're able to start bridging those gaps, it kind of starts creating that change in the dynamic. And like you brought up with, you see this going to couples counseling, and it breaks down to ultimately becoming a communication thing. It's the only dynamic shifting in those situations is having someone there to be able to ask the questions of, well, how are you, to be able to ask those questions so you guys can effectively communicate.
And I've seen some signs that trauma might be driving communication. One of them is that I've seen people who argue about small things, and yet the conversation tends to escalate quickly, and then the reaction doesn't match the moment. And
that's where you start seeing that breakdown, to where if you start arguing over those small things. It's kind of those menial topics, it just turns into, it's an ongoing argument all the time. And it doesn't really, you start holding on to those negative emotions and feelings towards that other person when there's no need to.
And one of the most common ones that I've seen is when one of you shuts down during conflict and then silence replaces the engagement.
And I have been guilty of this in the past where I've shut myself down and not being able to effectively communicate because I don't know how to respond to that instance, or I don't know, kind of what's going on, or I don't want to unpackage like what's really going on with me inside.
Some people might feel like they're misunderstood even when they're really trying, and the intent and the impact doesn't always align. Sometimes things become incongruent.
When you're trying to explain that situation to make the other person understand, and you're saying the same thing over and over again, but they're not completely comprehending what you're trying to explain, well, maybe reformatting your way of explaining it might be able to help trigger to change that response.
And, something else that I've seen is where conversations start to feel like they're pressured instead of any kind of connection. And then talking starts to become stressful.
And that's when we start seeing ourselves shut down more on a regular basis. Instead of talking, you go home and you sit in silence, and you're just you're there, you're present, but you're not fully present.
A lot of times, I say this a lot to clients, and we've talked about it a lot, and you've seen it in my behavior quite a bit, to where stating the obvious becomes my go-to. And so when it comes to ways to be able to improve communication without fighting harder, sometimes all it takes is to just pause and to look at the person and say, right now, I'm feeling too pissed off to have this conversation with you. Is it okay if you give me 30 minutes to be able to cool down so I can collect my thoughts? And then can we return to this conversation? Going from things being hostile or upsetting and uncomfortable and stressful and all the things to just one of you kind of putting on the big boy pants and then taking that pause in life to be able to bring things down a little bit. Or even, Clint, I've told you, like, you're up here, you need to bring things down a little bit. And you might not recognize it when you have those emotions going through your system, but then me pointing out the obvious, it's a little embarrassing, I think, but also I'm not doing that to embarrass you. I'm doing that because I can't have an adult conversation with somebody who's running on emotion only.
Yeah. And I think that's where, when we feed into the emotion and we're running on just emotion, that's when you start saying things that you don't necessarily mean, or you're not able to articulate what your point of what you're trying to get across, and you bring that up to me, and I look at you and I'm like, oh, I'm operating at a high speed level right now that I need to calm the hell down.
It's so hard for us to be able to operate with clarity when we're operating through emotion. And I'm not saying that we need to take emotion out of the equation. That's very important to be able to contribute to the conversation in a way that's meaningful. But by just taking that moment and allowing ourselves to do whatever it takes to be able to slow the conversation down, then it makes sure that speed is not going to fuel any kind of reactivity.
And in those instances, like when Ashley brings that forward to me and say, you're up here right now, like sometimes we'll almost do like a pattern interrupt to where we'll go kind of break out of that emotional response, change it for 10, 20 minutes, and then we reapproach it.
Sometimes too, how we package the conversation can make a big difference. And I think it's important to create safety before trying to solve the problems. So if you and your other person are, and this could be with anybody, you're in a conversation that starts to feel hostile, or to where you start to feel like you want to become argumentative, and you know that you don't want the conversation to go that way because both of you ultimately want a resolution. It's important to understand that connection comes first. And that could be something as simple as, changing your environment, maybe literally going outside and having that conversation in the sun. It could mean just stating the obvious. Like, right now, I don't feel safe with the way that you're talking to me. Like, that's harsh, right? That sounds harsh. And this is not to be overused, right? And I'm saying this in a very authentic circumstance. I'm not saying it in some, because I've seen a lot of females, especially, who take advantage of those types of things. But if that isn't the norm for you, and the behavior that your partner is exhibiting is not something that you're comfortable with, stating the obvious of, like, this conversation doesn't feel safe right now. And you're not saying you don't feel safe. You're saying you don't feel like you're in a safe environment. Then you can both decide, like, okay, what do we need to do to make it feel more comfortable?
Yeah, and I think in those instances too, because you're not going to ever achieve the goal that you're truly looking for. You're talking in circles, and neither one of you feel understood or heard, and that's where you want to do that pattern interrupt in those instances, to be able to shift it to where you can have that good conversation with one another.
I hope you've gotten some value out of today's episode. If you have, do us a favor, drop a review, subscribe down below, and as always, know that I'm sending you a long, tight hug from my home to yours.